Okay, as Kevin mentioned, I'm Sarah Landry. I work for the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. So that's the trade organization here in Colorado that represents everything from oil and gas companies, so operators, to accountants, to attorneys, to engineers, etc. So the full gamut of most of the companies related to oil and gas exploration here in this state. As was mentioned, I work on our local regulatory affairs and community outreach and that kind of stuff. Essentially how this presentation is going to go is that I'm going to do a quick definition of what hydraulic fracturing is. Peter did a fantastic job of doing a lot of the technical engineering things, so I'll skip over casing and cementing as he's done a fine job of that. And then I'm going to address some of the misconceptions, but strictly relevant to water issues related to oil and gas operations. So that's where this presentation will go. So fracking fundamentals. So the way that the industry and engineers define hydraulic fracturing is the high pressure fracturing of rock at a very deep depth to release the resource. So a lot of times you'll hear a more broad definition, but for the purposes of my presentation, when I say hydraulic fracturing, it's the actual process of fracturing the rock. Why do we need to hydraulically fracture a well? So a lot of times you'll hear, if you don't fracture the well, you can still produce oil and gas. That's why this is called unconventional operations. In the past, where you've heard about, there were essentially large pools of resource under the ground and you could tap energy that way. In many cases in Colorado, that's not the type of resource that we're finding. What we're doing is we're extracting the resource from very tight shale formations. As Peter mentioned, right now, a highly targeted formation is called the Niobrara, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. But in order for the resource to actually flow out of the ground, we have to increase the surface area and allow that resource to flow out. So this is how dense the shale actually is. And this is the width of a human hair. So this goes to show that this is not porous. It's not like an aquifer where the water is very easily flowing through grains of sand or something like that. It's a very, very dense material that we're getting our energy out of. So this goes to show that when you fracture a well, specifically when you fracture a well on a horizontal lateral, you're increasing the surface area by monumental amounts. So what this is it's really allowing that resource to flow out. So what that enables us to do now, where it's historically taken us on a section 32 vertical wells to drain that resource, we can now use one well pad that has multiple lateral wells coming off of it. And so this well pad is bigger, it's a bigger well pad, but overall our surface impact is greatly reduced because we're able to go down, drill horizontally, and then fracture that well. This is just a quick slide to show the history of fracturing. These fractures were vertical fractures, but this is just to show that the first fracturing jobs were done in the 1947 area. The first time they combined hydraulic fracturing with horizontal drilling was in the 90s in the Barnett Shale that's in Texas. But when you look at the history of Colorado, we have over 150-year history of oil and gas operations here in the state. So we're one of the oldest producing states. If you look at, for example, and I have some pictures in a little bit, but the Fort Collins field, for example, the first hydraulic fracture done there was in 1952. There's the Boulder field, which I'll show some photos of, and those wells were drilled in the early 1900s. So we've had a long history of both our communities and our economy and all sorts of things interrelating with this industry. So we're going to get into some of the myths. These are the photos I just want to show you first off. So drilling is getting riskier. This is kind of the perception of what's going on right now, that technology has gotten ahead of us and that we're not really sure what we're doing. So this is the Boulder oil field. If you've driven between Boulder and Fort Collins, you've actually driven by this. This is along Diagonal Highway. So this is in 1903. This is the exact same viewpoint today. So this is to show that even with the technology and the regulations and all sorts of things from when that field was drilled, full remediation is possible. And our technology and our regulations have only improved and gotten better. So this is just an example from our historical operations. Hydraulic fracturing is injecting fluids into groundwater. This is one that Peter covered really well, so we're going to go through this fairly quickly. Let's see. What I want to show here is the depths. This is really important. What's being targeted most frequently around the state right now is the Niobrara, and that's typically located at about 7,000 feet. Now, in most areas of Colorado, the aquifers are above 1,000 feet. In the Denver-Julesburg Basin, there are certainly places where it's deeper. Here, I know that the most recent well that was drilled didn't even come into any sort of contact with an aquifer at all. It was completely dry. But if you think about how far down we're drilling, it's 10 Wells Fargo buildings stacked end to end, 7,000 feet down. So there's over a mile of impermeable Pierre shale between where we're drilling and where the drinking water source is. So that's important to keep in mind. We've gone through casing. I just want to reiterate that the purpose of these multiple layers of steel and cement are to isolate the drinking water from what's going up and down that well bore. This is what it looks like. This is from a well pad that was in El Paso County. But this is just to show that this is legitimate steel. These are real pipes. This isn't any sort of flimsy plastic or anything like that. Another thing that we hear a lot is about the chemicals that are used in the fracturing fluid. The fluid is 99.5% water and sand. There is a lot of water used. The sand is used to actually hold up the fractures that are created. So there's sometimes an idea that we're creating these very large cracks in the earth. They're so small, they're hairline fractures that must be held open by this proppant. So these grains of sand, to ensure that it's held open under that pressure of the over mile of Pierre shale to ensure that the resource does flow out. Why do we need to use these additives? Why do we even need to use chemicals at all? Some of the chemicals are used as biocides to prevent any sort of bacteria growing in the well. A lot of them are used to make sure that the proppant is properly carried into the fractures. So sometimes they're gelling agents to make it very viscous to carry it. Sometimes you have to have slick water. Lots of different things are going on here. This is a list of some of the common additives that are used in some of their other uses as well. These are things, as you can see, you're not going to want to drink something that's used for bleaching hair. What's important here is how we manage those fluids. So when we manage them, that they're properly contained. If there is a spill or release, that it's properly cleaned up and remediated. That's the purpose of showing you that, yes, these are things that you can find under your kitchen sink, but just as with bleach or something like that under your kitchen sink, you want to keep it in the proper container. You want to keep people that aren't trained to be around it away from it. You want to have properly trained people handling it. And that if you spill bleach in your kitchen, you're not going to leave it there. You're going to properly clean it up. A lot of times we'll hear 500 chemicals are being injected into the ground. That's not accurate. I like to look at this like when you're going to a grocery store and you're going to cook one meal, and you're cooking a fancy meal tonight. So say you're going to go and you're going to cook steak and potatoes and asparagus. When you walk into that grocery store, there are hundreds of ingredients for you to choose from, but you're just cooking one specific meal. So you're going to get your steak, and you're going to get your potatoes, and your garlic, and your butter. I'm from Louisiana, so a lot of butter. Asparagus, salt, pepper, etc. You're going to come away with a handful of things because it's specific to that one thing that you're doing. It's much like drilling a well in the sense that across the country, hundreds of different additives can be used and are used. But for that specific well and that specific subsurface geology, it only requires about 7 to 12 additives. So I'll show you in a little bit where you can go to find out what those are. The point is that what works to drill a well where I'm from in Louisiana is going to be vastly different from what works here in the Rocky Mountains. So hundreds of chemicals across the nation, but on a well-by-well basis, it's a much smaller amount. So this is the Frac Focus website that was alluded to earlier. It's fracfocus.org. It's integrated with Google Maps. So you would probably be able to intuitively know how it works when you sign into it. So this is the state of Colorado. It shows you where some of the main drilling places are going on. And then you can zoom in to any location And what you can see is that these little blue pin marks are wells. And attached to each one of those pin marks is a PDF that'll look like this, and I can see that it's a little small. But what it does is it shows you what's in that fracturing fluid. Now, earlier trade secret was mentioned. So if something is a trade secret additive, they still have to list the chemical family name and the concentration that's being used. Additionally, if there was some sort of incident that required someone to seek any sort of medical assistance, that information would be made available immediately. Not only are there MSDS sheets, but there's also a 1-800 number that if you need the full ingredients immediately, they can be reached at any well site. So drilling and hydraulic fracturing uses too much water. Tracy's going to be covering this, so I'm going to quickly skim over it as well. The state did a study in 2010 on our actual water use, so these aren't estimates. And what they found is that of our actual water use, 0.08% of our water was used for hydraulic fracturing. So that's not 8%, that's 8/100ths of 1% of actual water was used. So yes, when you hear it's 2 to 5 million gallons per horizontal fracture, it sounds like a lot of water, but we need to put that into context. Then they did a build out, assuming that because the Niobrara is kind of this hot play right now, there's going to be more operations. And so even when they did the build out in 2015, it was 1/10 of 1%. This is just an example of a municipality that sells their water for oil and gas operations. So this is Greeley's water use from 2011. They sold quite a bit of water to oil and gas operators, but even then it just goes to show that it was just 2% of their municipal water use. And they sold that at a premium to oil and gas money, to oil and gas operators, so they made profits off of that as well. This is just to go and show that for different energy resources, the amount of water it takes to produce the same amount of energy. So as you can see, shale natural gas is the most effective use of water for energy production here. Another point is that we have to consider the whole life cycle of natural gas. So when you burn natural gas, water is actually a byproduct of this. So over the whole life cycle, there is water actually produced as well. Hydraulic fracturing causes earthquakes. So this is one that we commonly hear. And let's see. So this goes to disposal wells. This is something that Peter touched on earlier. When we're done with our water, as was mentioned, a lot of times we can reuse the water that we use to hydraulically fracture a well on different well pads, but eventually an operator is done drilling wells for that period of time, and so they have to dispose of the water. Like many other industries, oil and gas uses injection wells. These are regulated by the EPA, and then that authority has been delegated to the state of Colorado for oil and gas wells. Across the country, there are 600,000 injection wells. A third of those are attributed to oil and gas. Those are classified as Class 2 injection wells. What happens is this is long-term, permanent, high-pressure disposal of wastewater. So we know that these can be attributed to, let's see, seismic activity. Two of these were in the news, I guess, 2 years ago now. But if we look at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in the 60s, when the Army was using injection wells there, they caused an earthquake. So Colorado has a history with disposal wells and seismic activity. So what they've done since the issue with the RMA is they've really partnered with the Colorado Geologic Survey to ensure that injection wells aren't placed in areas of known seismic activity. In the recent cases where the earthquakes have allegedly been linked to these injection wells, what's happened is that they've placed them in areas of known seismic activity. So essentially, they've lubricated a fault over a long period of time, and that tension was released in the form of an earthquake. This is where those events fell on the Richter scale. And so then people will say, well, Sarah, you know, fracturing does cause microseismic activity. And it does, just as if somebody stormed out and slammed the door, that would cause microseismic activity. If a truck drove by, it would do it as well. There's a professor at Stanford named Mark Zoback who actually came to a conference in Beaver Creek recently, and I was lucky to hear him speak. And he did a study that found that The microseismic of hydraulic fracturing is akin to holding a jug of milk at this height and dropping it 7,000 feet under the ground. So it's not something that you're going to feel at the surface. There is microseismic activity related to it, but hydraulic fracturing does not cause earthquakes. There is no data showing groundwater is protected. This is a slide similar to what Peter showed earlier. Before our mandatory groundwater baseline sampling rule was passed earlier this year, there was mandatory sampling in the San Juan Basin. So for 2,000 wells, for over 2,000 wells and over 7,000 samples, there's been no contamination. Additionally, prior to this state rule, COGA had a voluntary program that 93% of the new wells drilled in Colorado last year fell into this program. So there was already baseline water sampling going on. We have very proactive operators that are here in the state wanting to show you that the water is safe. So quickly on the new rule that passed for this area, what it is that when a new well is drilled, 4 samples are taken within a half-mile radius, and there's 4 sources, 1 sample before you drill at all, and then there's 2 samples that are taken afterwards from each of those sources as well. I'm going to quickly go through kind of where the activity is on the state and what's changed over the last several years. So these are our oil and gas basins. You looked at a similar map for the water wells, but this is just to show you that right up here is where that greater Wattenberg area is. So those are that's the sweet spot of the Niobrara field as of right now. So at the beginning of January 11, this is permits. So these are wells that are being drilled around this time. There was an equal split between Garfield and Weld County in terms of where operators were planning to drill. By the end of the year, you can see that half of the permits went to Weld. So does anybody know what that is? She does. It's because typically oil and natural gas prices have always tracked each other. But up until recently, they've split. And so what that means is that folks are really looking for liquids at this point. And the Niobrara Shale right here is very liquids rich. So some operators that were on the West Slope have come over to the Front Range to see exactly where in this shale region they can find economic wells. So just really quickly on state and local benefits, I'll go through this quickly. Every other year, COGA does an analysis through the University of Colorado Leeds School of Business, where they analyze the economic impact of this industry on the state. So we're going through it right now. So this is our 2010 data. And what it shows is that there are 107,000 jobs attributed to this industry just in Colorado, and $1.1 billion in public revenue came from this industry. So to put that in perspective, for that year, that was 15% of the general fund. And these monies, so in terms of severance taxes and all that kind of stuff, they fund DNR, they fund a lot of our water projects, all sorts of things. If you go to our website, which is on this page, coga.org, there's a lot of fact sheets. It's being redone right now. It's kind of hard to find things. But there's a lot more information there. We wanted to keep it just to water, obviously, for this forum. But please feel free to go there. Additionally, please, if you have more questions, please email this email address. It's mine. I didn't bring any cards today, so write it down now. And I'd be happy to get back to you. And thank you. I appreciate it.